For this project, you'll need a few things. The first is this pre-designed sampler that I designed. You can purchase at my Etsy shop, but you certainly don't need that. You could also use a plain piece of cotton or linen, something that's not stretchy. You'll also need a backing fabric. For that, I also like to use cotton or linen. In my example, I'm just going to use one big piece of linen that's been folded over on itself. It's a good idea to pre-wash it so you don't have any shrinking. You'll also need some thread. I like to either use 6-strand floss, that's the most traditional choice and it's really versatile, or pearl cotton, comes in lots of beautiful colors and also comes in different weights. For our purposes, I think the best weight is to use size 8. For fun, on some of the later stitches, you might also like to have some decorative threads. This is hand-dyed sock yarn. You could use any kind of yarn that you have left over from a knitting project, just the tail ends. Another great thing to have around for some weaving stitches is a metallic thread or even a metallic ribbon would work really beautifully. Next thing you're going to need are some tools, some small scissors that are nice and sharp and can cut right down at the base. I like to have pin cushions to keep everything neat and tidy. You might also like to have something to protect your fingers. Some people like a thimble. My personal favorite are these inexpensive rubber paper sorters that you can buy at the office supply store. They help you grip the needle as well as push the needle through your fabric. The next thing that you might like to have is a little bit of beeswax. It makes the needles easier to thread because it stiffens it up a little bit. Speaking of needles, there are 3 main types of needles that you'll need to have. The first is a plain old embroidery needle, which are called that. The second is a milliner's needle, which are handy for knotted stitches, although not essential. If you can't find them, you can just use the embroidery needles. And the last thing is a tapestry needle, which is great for some woven stitches to use those bulkier yarns that we talked about a second ago. The last thing you'll need is an embroidery hoop. There are 3 main types of these. Wooden, which is the easiest to find. You might also find a metal embroidery hoop or a plastic. These are also readily available. That's all you need, so let's get started. The first thing I like to do when I'm getting ready to embroider is to thread needles. And this is actually something that's great to do on an off day when you're in the mood to do something kind of mindless. It's great to do while you're listening to a podcast or watching a movie or something. You can get tons of needles threaded, and then when you're ready to work on a project, you've got them all ready to go. So I like to keep them either in a pin cushion or in these wool needle holders. If you have a lot of needles, you might want to organize them by color, so you have one cushion for each color. So the next thing you want to do is pick out what kind of thread you're going to use. I'm going to use this 6-strand embroidery floss. Take off these paper ends from the 6-strand floss. You can see I've already done that on this one. This is a variegated floss, which I love using. It kind of keeps me interested as I'm sewing along. It's arranged in this big loop, so I like to open up the loop the best I can and then get out the length that I want to work with. You don't want to have more than about a yard, so I pull it out like that, and now I'm going to cut that length off. This is called 6-strand floss because it's made up of 6 strands. However, almost no one uses all 6 strands at once. Most of the time you're going to separate it into any combination of those 6 strands to make, depending on how thick you want your mark to be. I like to talk about embroidery as being kind of a way of drawing. So just like in drawing, you could embroider with a mechanical pencil or a kind of a duller pencil and make a thin line or a thicker line. It's the same way with embroidery floss. You can separate it into 1 strand, or you could use 5 strands depending on what you want. I'm going to separate my thread into 2 sets of 3. So I'm going to kind of flay it out with my fingers until I can see that I have 3 in one hand and 3 in the other, and then I'm going to slowly pull it apart. I always like to say that sort of the slowness of separating the threads prepares you for the slowness of embroidery, and the faster you go, the more likely it is that you're going to have tangles. So just go nice and slow and try to be kind of zen about it. And you can see I'm just slowly pulling it apart. If I start to get a tangle, I can stop and sort of rearrange my hands. But slow and steady wins the race. You can see I've got a little tangle there, so I'm just going to work my hands down until that sort of improves the tension. And so this one, I'm just going to kind of wrap around my hands like this so it stays neat and doesn't get all in a tangle while I'm working with that second piece. So I can set this aside. Let's just set that over here. And with this thread, I'm now going to thread my first needle. So the strands, when you get ready to thread, they're all separate. So you can either kind of lick it in your mouth like that to get them to all stick together and put it through your needle. If you find that they're still tangly or you just don't want to put your thread in your mouth, this is where you can use the beeswax, and you just press the end of your thread into the beeswax like that with your thumb, and then pull the thread out like that, and that just keeps everything neat and tidy. So now I'm going to pick a needle out of this pack. These are embroidery needles, and I like to use the ones in the middle first. They have the biggest eyes and they're the easiest to thread. So sometimes I never make it to the ones on the outside. I buy another pack so I can have these big eyed needles. So I'm going to pull this one out. If you're having trouble threading the needle from one direction, I think it's useful to think about the way that the needle was manufactured, and that is with some kind of a punch device. So it was punched from one side or the other. So a lot of times if you're having trouble threading from one direction, if you just turn your needle 180 degrees, it might be a lot easier to thread it from the other side. There might be just a tiny microscopic flange. Now that your needle's threaded, you have your first design choice to make. So my thread is 3 strands thick. I have a long piece like this that's gone through the needle, and I have a short end over here. If I want my lines to be 3 strands thick, I can tie a knot at the long end and be ready to go. However, I want my stitches to be a little bit thicker, so I'm going to take the short end and meet it up with the long end and tie those 2 ends together to get back to 6 strands. So I'm just going to tie a knot right here. The way that I like to tie the knot is to grab the 2 ends of the floss, or the one end if you went with a thinner line. I just grab it between my middle finger and my thumb, and then I'm going to roll it over the top of my pointer finger. So just roll it like that, and then kind of make a twisting motion, and that creates that first knot. It's a nice idea to do another one right over the top of it. So you can see I'm just putting my finger over the top of that thread. Oops. Over the top, and then it's just going to go around, and then I pull it tight, and that makes a second knot right on top of the first. Once you've tied the knot, I like to trim it so that you have not a lot of thread on the other side of the knot. That prevents you from pulling the thread through to the wrong side of your fabric, to the right side of the fabric, I should say, when you start embroidering. A question that you might be having is why we separated our thread out. We had 6 strands, and then we separated it into 3 strands, and then we tied it back together to make 6 strands. It's a good question. And the reason is if I threaded through 6 strands right through the eye of my needle to begin with, then doubled it over in order to get it through the fabric and carried along in the needle, then I would actually have 12 strands right here, which is a lot to pull through your fabric, and you end up having these kind of puncture wounds all over your cloth and messing up the tension in your hoop because of the amount of thread that's stuck there. So even though I like to sew with 6 strands at a time, I always separate it first into 3 and 3 and thread it through to get back to 6. It's an extra step, but it really will save you a lot of headache later by not having to be pulling with all your might on your thread to get it through your fabric. So that's the 6-strand floss. The other thing that you might like to sew with, my personal favorite, is pearl cotton. I like to use size 8. Pearl cotton doesn't separate like 6-strand floss. It comes in different sizes, so you can pick the size that you want and it's ready to go. It comes in these neat and tidy little balls, and it gets threaded the same way. So I pull it out, cut a little piece of it off, and I'm going to double this over as well, but you could also use a single strand if you wanted to have a thinner mark. Pick out your needle, dip it down into the wax to make it a little easier to thread, and then put it through the needle. Sometimes as you're trying to thread the needle and it gets a little frayed like that, rather than trying to smooth it out and giving yourself a headache about getting that piece through the needle, I just like to give it a trim, re-wax it, and start over. Thread is cheap. Don't try to work with a frayed thread. It will give you a giant headache. So There we go. Just gonna pull that through. And the same thing, I'm gonna tie these two ends together. You could leave it, I like a thicker mark, so I'm gonna tie the two together. Same thing between my middle finger and my thumb, and then my pointer finger goes over the top like that, and I just pull it together like that to make a knot. And I like to do one more on top of it, like that. There you go. And now I'm just gonna trim that off, and I'm just gonna stick that in my pin cushion so it's ready to work with. And now I'm ready to get the fabric in the hoop so we can get started embroidering. The hoop comes in two parts. No matter what kind of embroidery hoop you have, it'll be a two-part mechanism. So there's an inner part that doesn't have any hardware on it. In this case, this is a vintage metal hoop, so it's lined with cork, which grips the fabric really well. And then there's a top piece, which depending on what kind of hoop you have, it'll have some kind of hardware on it. This one has a spring. Sometimes they have a little nut and bolt. They might have a little tension bar. So that part goes on top, and the part without any hardware goes underneath. So I'm just gonna lay the bottom part down on the table. My fabric's been ironed already, but even if it hadn't, once you put it in the hoop is a magic device that takes away all wrinkles. So I'm gonna lay that down over the top of the bottom. I'm just gonna put that over the top. Once the hoop is in place, I like to go around on all sides and stretch the fabric to make sure it's nice and tight in the hoop. Just as a reminder, this is a double layer of fabric, which also really helps to maintain tension. It's a personal preference, it's not necessary, but if it's your first time embroidering, you'll probably have an easier time if you double up your fabric. So you have a layer on top and then another layer on the bottom. And again, make sure it's not a stretchy fabric. Cotton and linen tends to work the best. Now my fabric's tight in the hoop and I'm all set and ready to get started. The first collection of stitches that I'm going to show you are all line stitches, or ways of making lines on fabric. They're great for text, they're great for copying drawings, or they're also some of the easiest stitches that you can learn in embroidery. The first one I'm going to show you is the running stitch. If you're using the printed sample, this is where the running stitch is located. I also have some other examples of great ways of using the running stitch. Like here you can see this chicken is surrounded by running stitch. It's a great way to create sort of a radiating pattern. It's the easiest stitch, but used over and over, it creates a really amazing texture like you can see on this example. So now I'm going to show you how to do the running stitch. You can remember that I've already knotted my thread and my needle's ready to go. I'm going to put the thimbles on my fingers. I like to use 2 thimbles at a time, maybe a little bit unconventional. These are those rubber paper sorters that I mentioned before. I like to wear one on my middle finger and one on my pointer finger, and this just really helps grip the needle. So I've got a knot at one end of my thread. I'm going to pick my hoop up and come up from the back. I want the knot to be behind my fabric or on the back side. That's the traditional way to do it. You might also want to have the knot on the front side of your fabric to create another area of texture and area of interest. It's up to you. Pull your thread all the way through until you can feel that the knot is at the back of the hoop. You might want to give it a gentle tug. Don't pull it too hard or the thread will come flying all the way out and you'll have to start over. Once your knot's at the back of your fabric, then you can get started. There's 2 ways to do the running stitch. The first is this sort of stab method. So I'm just going to go down underneath with my needle and pull it again back to the back side. That, and I'll skip a space, come up a bit, come to the front side, and then I'm going to go down again. And you can see that's the first 2 running stitches. This one's going off a little bit at an angle, that's okay. So that's the stab method. You might find that it's faster, and if you're worried about having your lines being nice and straight, a nice way to do it is that you can line up a bunch of stitches on your needle at once by going in and out of the fabric and sort of modulating the fabric up and down. Can you see how my fingers are moving the fabric up and down? Using my fingers on the bottom and my thumb on top, I can make sort of a system of hills and valleys. So I'm going to come down and up in one motion with the needle. So I'll bring it out and show you again. So I'm going down, then bring my needle back up. I'm going to go down again and bring my needle back up. And those stitches now are one right in front of the other. The thread can't do anything except follow the needle around. It doesn't have a mind of its own. It has to follow the needle just like the caboose follows the engine. So a nice way to get nice, straight, even stitches is to get a bunch on the needle at once. And then you can see I'm using the back of my finger to push that needle through. And now I'm using my fingers to grip the thread and pull it all the way through. With that method, you can see that we got 3 stitches in one motion instead of just one at a time. So it's a lot faster and perhaps more economical. I think I have room to do about 2 more before I get to the end of the area that my hoop is using. So now I want to turn around and go back in the other direction and make another line that's parallel to this. You might also want to turn and go at a right angle. I think I'm going to go back around and do another line in the other direction. So I'm going to do that stabbing method again and go down underneath. I'm going to pull this all the way through. I'm going to turn the fabric around this way and stitch back in the other direction. So just lining them all up. Each stitch is going to have a friend right on top of it or right below it. You can make your stitches any way you like and whatever color you like. It's totally up to you. 2 more stitches. 1, I can get this one on the same needle load. I'm going to come all the way up and then go down, straight down underneath. You want to tie off on the back when you're running out of thread. Don't wait until you only have an inch left of thread because it'll be really difficult to tie a knot in the back. So tie your knot off when you've got about 4 inches. So I'm just going to flip over to the back side. My thread's here waiting for me. And there's a couple different ways that you can tie your knot. You could weave your needle in and out of these stitches and cut it off. The thing that I like to do is to tie a little knot. So I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to find the nearest stitch to where my thread is coming out. So I'm going to go under this stitch, and I'm not going through the fabric, sort of going under the bridge, so to speak. So my needle's going under that line. I'm going to pull it all the way through. And then I'm going to take my needle again and go under again in the same direction. And as I pull that through, you can see that it's creating a loop. And right before it closes all the way in on itself, I'm going to go through this loop and pull it the rest of the way with this thread in the middle of that loop, and that creates a knot. I just pull that down on itself. I'm kind of holding with one finger behind that knot, and then I put my thumb down on top of the knot and give it a little tug. Don't pull too tight or it'll mess up the tension and might pull the thread through in a weird way. But that's all there is to it. And then once you've tied that knot, I just cut it really close to where the knot is, 1 millimeter or 2 showing and not much more. You want to make sure you don't have a long tail. That's why you cut it nice and short right up against the knot. If you have a long tail, you risk bringing those threads back to the front side as you continue on and might do another embroidery stitch around that area. Next thing I'm going to show you is how to do the filled running stitch, which is a way to sort of take this to the next level. So I have a piece of fabric over here that I've stitched a lot of running stitch onto, and I'm going to show you a few different ways of doing the filled running stitch on this example. The first thing you'll need for the filled running stitch is a different kind of needle. So you've already done some running stitch with a nice sharp needle, and now I'm going to fill it in with a thicker yarn. Normally when you're embroidering, you use 6-strand floss or pearl cotton like we talked about before, but the filled running stitch is one of the weaving stitches. So it's a stitch that really stays on top of the fabric and kind of weaves in and out. So it's an opportunity to use a thread that's otherwise really difficult to work with, like a metallic thread, a really thick wool. Rayon threads can be kind of a pain to use, and they're great for weaving stitches. I have a bunch of tapestry needles over here that have already been pre-threaded with things like a thicker pearl cotton. This is size 5 pearl cotton. This is a cotton tapestry yarn, this army green. I also have some yellow metallic. You could also use wool. Sock yarn works really well here. You could use a thin ribbon, anything that can get through the relatively large eye of a tapestry needle. The thing that's special about these needles is that they're dull, so they're not going to split your threads. So I'm going to pick out a green thread, and get started filling one of these stitches. So the easiest one to do of these filled running stitches is to just fill in a single line. So I'm going to start with this red line here that's already been stitched. It's just a single line of red running stitch. To get started, I'm going to bring this needle up from the back just like I started with the regular running stitch. And that's really the only time that this tapestry needle is going to go up and down through the fabric until I get all the way to the end of the line. So I brought my thread all the way up. The knot is at the back. And now I'm going to shimmy underneath this stitch. And what I mean by that is I'm just going to kind of go under the bridge like we did when we were tying the knot. I'm not going to split the fabric and I'm not going to split the thread. I'm just going underneath this stitch. So my needle's going through and I'm just going to pull this all the way to the other side and bring my needle back around. And for this variety of the filled running stitch, I'm just going to come through and my needle's going to go through from the same side on each stitch. So it went through from my right over here, and now it's going to go through from the right side on this next stitch. And this is going to create sort of a swirling line that looks a bit like a rope. This one's going to go through in the same direction. Sometimes you have to kind of, you can see how I'm pushing the fabric down to make that stitch a little more accessible. Pulling that all the way through, just keeping it nice and neat, and you can see how it creates this kind of scalloped effect. Okay, I mentioned this before, but this is a cotton tapestry yarn. You could also use cotton, a crochet cotton, any kind of yarn. It's fun to go to the yarn store and look at things that might fit through the eye of your tapestry needle. There's so many beautiful hand-dyed textures and colors that are made for knitters, but they can also be used in some of these weaving stitches in embroidery. Oops. Oops, see that? I almost split the fabric, so now I'm just gonna push that down so I make that bridge a little more easily accessible and pull it through. Almost to the end. And now I'm going to go through this last one. Now we're finished with that line. The last thing to do is to poke down underneath the back side and tie off just like we did before. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to get these tapestry needles up and down through the fabric, and just give it a little push. There we go. So I'm going to pull this all the way to the other side. Flip it over. I'm going to tie this off in the same way. So I'm just going to go under that nearest stitch, pull it all the way through, then I'm going to go under again. You can see that loop is there. Just go through the loop, pull it, and that creates a knot. I like to do that twice. Just make sure it's extra sturdy. So I go through again, there's that loop again, pull it, and that's a knot. So same thing, I'm going to trim that really close to where the knot was, put this needle away, and select a new color. Now I'm going to show you how to do a filled running stitch with two parallel lines, which creates this really neat chain-like effect. I've got two pink lines here. I think I'm going to pick out a purple to go through those with. So I've got, this is a purple pearl cotton that's, I think this is size 5 pearl cotton that's been doubled up. If you don't have pearl cotton and all you can find is the 6-strand floss, that's the most readily available thing to embroider with and works really well. You can use that doubled up. You could put all 6 strands through the tapestry needle and tie it together, or just use all 6 strands by themselves without tying the ends together, just tying one little knot. And that works really great too. It makes a nice, beautiful mark, and it comes in a zillion colors. So I'm going to do a double filled running stitch. You can see here I've got 2 lines of pink running stitch. They're parallel to each other, or like a repeating row of equal signs, as I referred to before. I'm going to come up and go through 2 at a time and changing which direction I go, kind of creating a rickrack effect. So coming up under here, underneath one of the lines at the very beginning of the row, make sure your knot's at the back. And then instead of going under just one, I'm going to go under both. Pull it all the way through. And then at the next set, I'm going to go under from the other direction, pulling this way. Now going back in this direction, For this stitch, you want to make sure you have a nice brand new needle full of thread. Not a new needle, but a newly threaded needle, so that you can get all the way from one end to the other, and then we're going to go back again. So you don't want to have to change thread. You want to have a nice long piece, at least 18 inches long. I'm going to go back in this direction. Here. Now back this way. Now I'm at the end of the line, and I'm going to reverse the way I've been going, go back and fill it in. So I'm here, I'm going to turn right around, I'm going to close that gap to create the first chain link. Like that. And depending on how tight you pull the thread, that'll determine how tight the links are. You can see I'm not pulling very hard on these links. I want them to stay nice and open and flat. If I pulled a lot on them and had a lot of tension, they would kind of squeeze in on themselves and not look as nice, in my opinion. You can experiment and figure out how you want your links to look. I'm going to go back in this direction, and again, I'm not splitting any of the stitches, I'm just shimmying under all of the existing stitches. And I'm pulling gently. When I get it to the position that I like, I sort of stop pulling on it. I'm going back in this direction. My chain links are forming. I've got 3 already and 3 more to go. Pull on it there. And now I'm ready to close this last link off and be finished. I'm going to go down through the same exact hole that I came up in originally to finish this off and close the loop, but you also want to avoid the knot that's on the back side of your fabric and not go through it, because it'll make it really hard to pull the needle through. So on the back side, I'm sort of pulling the knot off to one side with my fingernail, and then on the front side I'm putting the needle through until I find that sweet spot where there's no knot on the back but it's still the same hole. And then I'm going to just pull that through, and I can switch to the back side. You can see that you can't see any of the purple thread on the back side. All you see is the knot where you started and where the thread is coming out now. So I'm going to knot it off, and then we can start on the next row. So same deal, pull it through once, pull it through again, that creates that little loop, zip through it like that. I'm going to make a second one just to make sure it's nice and sturdy. So I just pull it on through until it's got that little loop. I go through it, pull it tight, and that's it. I'm just going to trim the thread till it's just a little bit above that knot and no more. There we go. There's 2 versions of the filled running stitch. There are so many more that you could do. You can kind of experiment and weave in and out of these stitches. I have a swirly line here. You could have one going this way and another color going that way. You can have 3 parallel lines. Set up a grid for yourself and then go wild with different colors and textures. I have a couple other examples of the filled running stitch that I'd like to show you. There's some on this sample. There's that chicken again. Here's a good example. This is a yellow running stitch, and it's been filled in with a kind of a fuzzy green polyester yarn. Anything will work. Anything you can get in the needle will work, and this is just the cheapest green polyester. I think it looks great. Up here in this area, this is a single line. It's just a yellow running stitch filled in with pink pearl cotton. Up here, this one is a red running stitch filled in with blue floss. I've got another example over here, pink. So this is a red running stitch filled in with pink thread, a blue running stitch filled in with pink thread as well. I love the filled running stitch because it's really easy, but it tends to look kind of complicated. To someone who doesn't know about embroidery, they'll think that you slaved away all day at this, but in fact, it's really simple. It's just an easy running stitch filled with an easy weaving stitch to make a complicated chain link pattern. The next stitch I'm going to show is the back stitch, and the back stitch is the stitch that I use the most in my artwork because it's just a straight line. It's a straight uninterrupted line. The last one was a dashed line. This is just one straight line. I'm going to show you on the printed sampler because there's a nice line to follow. If you don't have the printed sampler, you could draw a line on your fabric with a pencil or a disappearing ink pen. This line is the one that I'm going to follow. It's the stem on this flower. I've got a green picked out. You could use any color you want. Just because it's a stem doesn't mean it has to be green. I'm going to come up at the very beginning here. And for this stitch, I like to use that stabbing method that I mentioned before. So I'm going to come up right on that line. I'm going to go forward. Starts out looking just like the running stitch. Now I'm going to skip ahead a spot. The space created should be about the same length as that first stitch created. Come back up. And now I'm going to go back down in this hole right here where I started and fill it in. That's why it's called the back stitch, because I'm always going back towards it. Ta-da! So that's the basic sequence for the back stitch. I go forward one, come back, fill it in. Now I'm going to start that basic sequence again, starting right here where I left off. Pull that thread all the way through. I'm going to go forward again. Skip ahead a spot. And sometimes you have to kind of poke around a bit with your needle until you come up right on that line where you want it. And don't be afraid to adjust and adjust and adjust till you get it just right. So I skipped ahead a spot. I'm going to go back, fill it in. I'm going right down in that same spot, or the same hole that I came out in originally. Pull it through, and that's my second sequence of the back stitch. So now I can come up again and do it the same thing again. You just repeat that. I'm going to stitch a few so you get the idea. If you're going on a curve, you'd want to make your stitches shorter than if you're going on a straight line. So if your stitches are this big on a straight line, you'd want to make them about that big on a curved line so it doesn't end up looking too rectilinear. You want it to have a nice smooth line. So this is a slight curve, so my stitches are about half a centimeter. So you're sort of skipping ahead every other time. I'm going to stop here even though the line's not quite finished, but you can see you just go on like that. The back stitch is a straight line, so it's great for things like any kind of line work. It's a great way of drawing on fabric. I have a couple of examples over here. This chicken that we keep referring to is back stitch. It was drawn on first with a disappearing pen, covered in back stitch, and then the disappearing pen was washed out. The back stitch is also a great choice for text because it's just a plain, simple line, so you can really mimic a particular penmanship or a particular font really well. And this text here was all done with back stitch. You can see its text is really small, so the stitches are much smaller than the demo that I showed you in order to follow those curves and really mimic that exact penmanship that was drawn on the fabric. Our last line stitch is the couching stitch, which is sort of a reverse of the filled running stitch. You're going to be using 2 needles at once for this stitch. So you need one needle that's sharp, that has a relatively thin thread in it. I'm using a needle that's threaded with pearl cotton that's been tied together at the ends. Again, that's size 8 pearl cotton. And then in another needle, a tapestry needle, I've got another weight of pearl cotton. This is size 5 that's been doubled up. You can see it's much thicker. If I lay the two down together, the red is much, much thicker. I'm going to demonstrate the couching stitch on this printed sampler, but you could, again, use this stitch on anything that has a line already drawn on it. It is really helpful to have a line to follow for this stitch so you can get a really precise look, but if you want to go crazy and just kind of do freestyling couching, that might look also really beautiful. To begin, you have your thick thread. You're going to bring that up from underneath, right at the beginning of this line that's printed. I'm going to pull that thread all the way through, make sure the knot is all the way at the back, and then I can kind of let that thread go. I'm not going to interact with that needle until I get to the end of my line. From now on, I'm going to be sewing with the green thread. So I'm going to move the hoop a little bit so that I can easily access this red thread with my thumb. I'm going to be pushing this thread from side to side with my thumb while I'm sewing or embroidering with this green thread in my right hand, since I'm right-handed. So to begin couching down this red line, I'm going to come up right on the line with my green thread, about a half a centimeter away from where the red thread comes out. I come up with the green thread. I'm going to come up right on the line. I'm holding the red thread to the side. And now with my thumb, I'm going to push the red thread to the other side and go down with my green thread exactly where I came up, watching out for that knot in the back. Pull that all the way through. And you can see that green thread makes the red thread snap right onto the line where you want it. If you lay down the red thread right in the middle and try to make your stitches go over the top of it, the red thread's laid down right on the line, you're gonna have a hard time making sure that your green threads are nice and neat, and you'll end up with these really big marks over the top of the red thread. So it's better to push it off to one side, come up with the green. Now I'm gonna push the red over to the other side and go back down in that same hole that the green came out of, go back down in it. And again, it's gonna snap the red right onto that line where I want it. I'm gonna come up again here. This is off to one side. Now I push it to the other side, go right back down in that same spot. Snaps right to that line. And the same thing, you just keep kind of swishing the red from side to side with your thumb as your other hand holds the green and goes up and down. Obviously, you can pick your own color choices. If you don't like red and green, use your own colors. These stitches are about equal length apart. You could make yours closer together. You could have two close and then one far. You can vary it. It's really up to you how you want to design your sampler, and you can sort of design it as you go. One cool thing about couching is you can see the red thread, the needle that has the red thread in it, the thread is doubled up. So if I wanted to, at some point, half of it could go off in one direction and get couched down, and half of it could go off in another direction and get couched down. And then they could also come back together. So you can create these little sort of tributaries that come and go. You can see how that's drawn on here on the sampler to suggest that idea. I'll show you an example of that look in a minute. Come up again here, go back down, do one more stitch, and then we'll tie off on the back. Come up, go down. I'm gonna bring my green to the back, and now I can bring back this red, and I'm gonna go back underneath with it. Pull that all the way through. Something got caught in there. That's just a little piece of fuzz from the table. I'm going to pull that out. Couching is great because when you get to the back side, you have two threads. So I like to tie them just like I'm tying my shoes, like an overhand knot. So just tie the two together as long as they're close by. And then I'm going to do that a second time. It's an unusual situation where you have threads like this. This can also be useful for any stitch if you wait too long to knot off, and let's say you only have a couple inches, it's not quite enough to tie the knot with using the needle. You can just cut the thread really close to the needle and just tie an overhand knot quickly and easily with your fingers, with your bare hands. Now I'm going to clip those same as I did before, like that. I have a couple other examples that I'd like to show you of couching. Here, this one has a lot of couching on it. This is cheap polyester yarn, just white, that's been couched down with orange thread. Here you can see it's couched down with green. Got some more over here. This is pink DMC floss that's been couched down with black. And then on this piece, there's an interesting bit of couching here where you can see it's pink thread couched down with blue, and the thread split off at a certain point. Part of it went in one direction, part of it went in the other, and they met back up here. Couching is the last line stitch that I have to show you. In our next segment, I'm going to show you a variety of ways of making some fancier decorative stitches. Now I'm going to show you some fancier stitches. The first one is going to be the straight stitch, and just because I said it's a fancy stitch doesn't mean it's very complicated. We're going to start with a really easy way of making a mark. These straight stitches, you can see the ones that are finished here, they kind of look like a little star or an asterisk. I'm using the printed version here so you can see where I'm going. This is a really simple stitch. I'm going to just come in from the outside and go into the center. I'm going to go to the next one, come in from the outside, go into that center in that same spot. This line starts here, but I'm going to extend it a little bit so it's more symmetrical. There you go. There's one finished. I'm going to stitch one more, the one right below it, sort of like a reflection. For this stitch, I'm using pearl cotton. This is a hand-dyed Romanian pearl cotton, but you could also use 6-strand floss, either 3 strands or all 6, like I talked about before. Since you're going up and down through the fabric, I don't recommend using metallic thread. If you've got a lot of patience and you're up for it, then go ahead and try it. Ta-da! So there's the straight stitch. The next stitch that we're going to do is a smoother stitch called the satin stitch, and it's a way to fill in space, so make sort of a solid surface of thread. It's a great way to make a filled in circle. You could use it to fill in text if you wanted to have a really chunky font. You can fill in a whole background with it. I'm going to show you how to just get started on a small scale and make a satin stitch circle on a separate piece of fabric over here. The first thing you want to do for the satin stitch is to outline it in the back stitch. So we learned the back stitch in the last segment. It's one of the best line stitches because it makes one long continuous line. I'm going to outline a little circle here that I'm then going to fill in with the satin stitch. So I'm using a variegated thread here. So I'm just going to embroider a tiny little circle and then I'm going to fill it in. I'm doing a circle because it's an easy shape to demonstrate, but you could do any shape, and later on I'm going to show you some samples of different things that have been satin stitched. If it's easier for you, you could draw on a shape first using a pencil or a disappearing ink marker. Okay, there we go. Now I've got a circle and I'm going to fill it back in. So starting on one side, I'm going to come up just inside that back stitched circle, and I'm going to make one long stitch that goes from one side to the other. This circle is less than 1/4 of an inch in diameter, so I can make one long stitch that goes all the way across it. You really wouldn't want to make your stitches more than about 1/2 inch long as a general rule. Of course, rules are meant to be broken, so your stitches could be a lot longer, but they might sort of start to wave in the wind. So I went down there, I came up right next to it, and I'm going to go across to the other side. That, come up right next to it here. I'm just going back and forth, filling it in. Oops, I've got a little knot there. A lot of times if you just poke your needle there, see how I just put my needle in that loop and that pulled that knot out. Don't panic if you get a knot. Most of the time you can get them out if you just take a deep breath and kind of relax as you're pulling it out. Then don't let the thread sense your tension. Okay, I'm just about done. I've got, let's see, maybe 1 or 2 more stitches. Let's see how much this fills. Take a look at that. That looks pretty good. If you've got any gaps, you can go in and add another line to fill it back in, but I think that looks pretty good. I did a small circle, but you can do any shape you want. It's great for chunky text or any shape that you want to fill in with a solid color. The next stitch that we're going to do is the blanket stitch, which is also sometimes called the buttonhole stitch, depending on how far apart the teeth are. So there's a lot of great examples of buttonhole stitch on the printed sampler, but to make things simpler and easier to understand, I'm going to show you how to do the buttonhole stitch or the blanket stitch. Again, you can use those interchangeably. I'm going to show how to do those on this blank piece of linen. For the blanket stitch, it's helpful to draw a line that you can refer to as you're sewing or embroidering. So I'm just going to use a disappearing ink marker. These dissolve in water. You could also use a pencil and just rub it away. And all my stitches are going to come back to that line. I'm going to use this red pearl cotton that's been doubled up on itself. And I'm working from left to right because I'm right-handed. That's the easiest way, I think, to do this stitch. You can see this top line here that I've just drawn. That's going to be the line that continues across the top, and all these stitches are going to come up and meet it, kind of like the teeth coming up to the gum line. So I'm starting here. As soon as my thread comes up from underneath, I grab it with my thumb. So my left thumb is controlling the thread, kind of like we did in the couching stitch, and my right hand is going to control the needle. So my needle is going to go down and then rock back up right on that blue line. It's a rocking motion like we did in the running stitch, the very first stitch. And then my right hand is going to take the thread and go behind the needle like that, catching the thread. And now I can push the needle all the way through, and that's going to create that first right angle or the first blanket stitch. Now I'm going to make one again right next to it. Here, rock my needle back up. This thread is going to come down behind it. I'm going to push my needle through the rest of the way, and now I've got two parallel blanket stitches. Keep going. This is called the blanket stitch because it's often used at the edge of a blanket. Sometimes it's also used at the edge of a napkin. It's used for applique. But it also makes a really beautiful decorative stitch for embroidery anywhere you want on your fabric. When it's called the buttonhole stitch, it's usually used, the stitches are much closer together and they're used to edge a buttonhole in garment making. So these are all pretty evenly spaced. One thing that's fun to do, I think, with the blanket stitch, let me pull that one down behind, is to vary the length of your stitches. So those were all about 1 centimeter long. Now I'm going to make a longer one and do some kind of staggered stitches. So I can do a long one and then a short one, or you could do stair steps. That's a long one. Now I'm going to do a shorter stitch, pull that behind, do long, short, long, short. Now I'm going to do a longer stitch here to get that back and forth. Do a short one. Another fun thing to do is to do them kind of stair stepping, so small, small, bigger, bigger, bigger. That's a little one. Now I can do sort of a medium stitch. Even bigger. This is a fun stitch to experiment with. There you go, you can see that stair-stepped effect. Now I'm going to stair-step it back out in the other direction. You could also use the blanket stitch as a way of couching, so if I had another thread under there that I was burying at the same time, you get sort of a multi-dimensional effect that way. Oops, threads are kind of tangly. I'm just going to go back in, straighten them out, and pull it. There we go. Do one more tiny little stitch, and then I'm going to show you how to finish it. So if I stop now and let go with my thread, you can see how that last thread kind of pops up. So to finish the blanket stitch, you just go up and over the last stitch that you did, right down in that right angle, right where the two lines meet. Just go up and over and then down to the back side of your fabric, and then you can tie a knot just like you did for the other stitches. So now I have some examples to show you of blanket stitch and satin stitch on these piles over here. Here's an example of the blanket stitch. There's some more over here of the stair stepping going up, down, so There's a bunch of it here that's yellow. On this example, the blanket stitch is used as it's meant to be on the edge, kind of tuck in the fabric and make a neat and tidy edge. I've done 2 layers of it here. And then on this example, I've used the blanket stitch to sort of frame the white area of this sample. You can see I've changed colors as I went along to make a frame. I also have some examples of satin stitch that I'd like to show you. This is an R that's been satin stitched almost, it's not finished. Somebody should come along and finish that one. And then this is also satin stitch. There's 2 layers of it. The outside is green and then the inner layer is pink. I have a bunch more fancy stitches to show you, but first I want to show you some easy stretches to do to make sure that your hands and eyes don't get too fatigued while you're embroidering. Just like any repetitive small motion, embroidery can really stress out your wrists and your fingers and your hands and lead to shoulder stress and other things. And your eyes can also get really tired. So while you're stretching your arms, it's a good idea to sort of look out as far away as you can. If you're inside a building, you can look out the window to the building that's across the street. If you're outside, you could look away to the farthest thing you can see. Just try to focus your eyes on the thing that's the farthest away from you and give your eyes a chance to stretch after being focused on something so close up. And then while you're doing that, you can take a chance to stretch your hand. So a first good one to do is to hold your hand out like this, like you're high-fiving someone, and pull your fingers back gently and just be really gentle with yourself so you don't hurt yourself. But it's a great way to kind of stretch out your wrist that way. And then you can switch hands and do the other hand like that. Just nice and easy. If it hurts, don't do it. And then I like to go in the other direction as well, and just stretching nice and gentle. Switch the other hand like that. Another stretch you can do is to hold both hands out in front of you. Don't lock your elbows, but just hold them out straight, and you can pretend like you're grabbing a piece of paper. You could also grab like a ping pong ball or pretend that you're grabbing a baseball. I'm just going to do a piece of paper and then just rotate your hands. So you go straight down and then rotate your hands in and then up. Flatten your hands out like this. Your wrists are flattened out, and then point your knuckles down to the floor, and then you can reverse it. Nice and slow. All the while you want to imagine that you're looking at something that's as far away as you can see. Down, up, and finish. So I just did one variation on that. You could, again, try your hands in different positions. Flat hand, fist, ping pong ball, baseball. Try it and just kind of stretch your hands out. Make sure that you're taking stretch breaks. I try to remind myself to do it about once every 20 minutes in the studio. On a good day, I set the timer so that I'm really making sure that I'm stretching and taking care of myself, and you should too. The next stitch I'm going to show you is the feather stitch. It's kind of a natural progression of the blanket stitch. It's worked in the same way with the thread going over the top of the needle. It's worked on an angle though. For the feather stitch, you want to be able to control the thread with your thumb that's not holding the needle, and the best way to do that is to arrange your hoop so that you're moving from the bottom of the hoop to the top of the hoop up the left-hand side if you're right-handed like I am, and vice versa if you're left-handed. So I'm going to start at the bottom here. I'm going to bring my needle all the way up. As soon as the thread comes up, I'm going to grab it with my thumb and lay it down in a U shape. You can see how it's a sort of an upside down U, or it looks like a finger pointing up. And now I'm going to come up with my needle. My thread is coming out here. I'm going to go down just to the right of this line where the thread is coming up. I'm going to go down and then rock my needle back up. And the needle, the thread goes behind the needle like that to create this little diagonal shape. And that makes the first notch in the feather stitch. Now my needle's coming back up, my thread's coming back up. As soon as it does, I grab it with my thumb and lay it down in that U shape again, but off to the other side. So now my needle's going to go up, down. I'm just going a little bit higher than I was on this side, so I can sort of slowly inch my way up the fabric, going down, up like that, pull the thread down behind, pull the thread all the way through, and that makes the second step in the feather stitch. I'm going to keep going like this, show you how it looks, and then I'm going to show you a variation. So I just go side to side. I think this stitch looks nicer if the stitches are closer together. You can experiment to see how close you can get them together. It really shows off the angles of the feather stitch the smaller you make it. I've got this big piece of satin stitch here, so I'm going to kind of curve around it to avoid that satin stitch area. In my own work, I like to start with found embroidery or something that someone else has embroidered. It's a nice jumping off point. It can help you pick out colors. It provides ready-made texture. And so, you know, I already had a satin stitch on this, and I thought I'll just keep going right over the top of it. To finish a line of feather stitch like this, when I get to the end here, you can see if I let go, that stitch starts to pop up. So in order to finish, I need to lay that thread down and go right over the top of it to the other side, and then pull through to the background. And that's where I would knot off. But first I want to show you another variation on the feather stitch. So I'm going to do a side-to-side three-stepped feather stitch. So come up here, and I'm just, instead, before I was going right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, this time to show you a variation, I'm going to go 3 to the right, 3 to the left. So I go 1, I go up a little bit higher, 2, 3, and here you can see how it's so much like the blanket stitch. It's just an angled blanket stitch. But now I'm going to lay this down to the left and go left, 1, 2, 3, and you just go on and on like that. So here's another one, off to the right. I'll do one more leg off to the left, and then we'll tie off and go on to the next stitch. 1, 2, 3. You end it just the same. Just go over the top right at that crux where the two lines meet, and you'll knot off and back. Got another needle here. I'm going to switch to yellow. The chain stitch is another one that you're going to want to work from bottom of the hoop to top of the hoop. And you also want to be, just like for the feather stitch, you want to be over on the left-hand side of your hoop because you want to be able to control the thread with your thumb while your right hand is controlling the needle. It's a two-handed operation. Come up from underneath. As soon as you're up, you grab the needle with your left thumb, just like as in the feather stitch. Tighten this up a little bit. Make sure your thread is all the way at the back, your knot is all the way at the back. And now you're holding this here out kind of like a C shape. I'm going to dip back down right where next to where I started and rock the needle back up. So I'm taking up a little bit of space there. No more than no more than about a quarter of an inch or a scant centimeter. Then I'm going to pull this yellow behind. And you can see here a little preview of what that first chain in the chain stitch is going to look like. And if it's the size you want, you can go ahead and pull the needle through. If you wanted it to be a little smaller, just take the needle out and start again. Now I've pulled that through. That's the first chain in the chain stitch. This thread is coming out right here. If I let go now, this petal shape is going to pop up. So I want to keep that laying down nice and neat. To make the next chain, my needle is going to go in right next to it, inside that petal shape. Rock back up again the same amount of space. Pull that thread behind. I laid it down here with my thumb, so it's just waiting for me. Pull it down behind, push the needle back up again. Give a little tug. Don't pull too tight, or instead of having nice petal shapes, you'll have flat lines of thread that aren't very attractive. Whoops. grab that again. Do a few more petals to give you the idea. Come up like that. Pull it down. Down. Pull it up. Around like that. The chain stitch is a great way to make sort of a bulky line. It can be decorative. It's also one used a lot in crazy quilting to cover seams, but it's also a great one to use for text and outlines and things like that. I'm going to just do a couple more stitches, and then I'm going to show you a variation on the chain stitch, which is a way to make individual petals called the Lazy Daisy. All right, I finished that last stitch. I'm just going to go up and over the top of that last petal shape to secure it, going through to the back. I'm going to knot off, and then we'll do a Lazy Daisy. I'm just going to knot this one off on the back. We've got another one back here that needs to be knotted off as well. I'm just going to tie this knot like that. We'll do a double one just like we did before. Make sure it's extra secure. I'm going to cut that. My scissors, I've got this one hanging out here that I didn't finish before, so I'm going to tie a knot in that one. This is an unrelated stitch. Snip that. And now we can go on to the Lazy Daisy. I'm going to pick a different color for the Lazy Daisy. Let's pick this kind of corally pink color. The Lazy Daisy is just petals that are not connected to one another like they are in the chain stitch. It's just individual petals, so each one is secured at the tip or the top of the shape. So I come up from underneath just like before, grab it with my thumb, then I go back down, rock my needle up again to the top of that petal shape. Got my little preview there. Then I'm going to go up and over to secure that petal. Next, I'm going to come back to that same spot and go out another direction to make the next petal shape of that flower. So I grab it with my thumb, rock my needle down, and then up again, bring it behind, like that. Now it looks like I have a pair of rabbit ears, but I'm going to keep going, make another petal shape. Keep going around to get the Lazy Daisy. Up and over. I'm going to turn my hoop so I can grab it easier. Grab it with my thumb. You could do as many petals as you want. You could have, you know, a really sparse daisy or a really dense carnation. I'll show you some examples of some really dense flower shapes in a minute. It's up to you how many petals you want to have. This one will have 6 or 7. Once you're finished with your daisy, you'll have a little space in the middle. At least I will. You could have them closer together so that there's no space in the middle. You could go back and fill that in with satin stitch, or later on in this workshop I'm going to show you how to do French knots. Those are another great choice for the center of the Lazy Daisy. Come up here, make one last petal. And then I'm just going to go over the top of this last one, finish, and there's the Lazy Daisy. Just going to knot this one off, and then we'll go right on to the Algerian eye. So same way, just go under once, under twice, that creates the loop, go through the loop. I like to do that twice. Trim it close to where your knot is, and you're all set. For the Algerian eye, we're going to use this printed sampler because it's got the lines drawn on already. If you don't have these lines drawn on in a starburst, you could easily draw them on with a disappearing pen like the one we used before for the blanket stitch. I'm going to pick a new color of thread. For this one, I have one that's already finished in kind of a grayish tone. I think I'll do a blue one next to it. So I've got some blue pearl cotton. The knot's already in it. The Algerian eye is a lot like the straight stitches that we did before. It goes all the way around instead of just halfway around. So just come up from the outside, you go down close to the center. It's going to leave a little open space, a lot like the Lazy Daisy did. So just making a bunch of stitches that come down around a circle in the center. I'm gonna find a spot there, hung up on that knot. There we go. This one just goes all the way around. Kind of fun using this variegated thread because as you stitch it changes color. It's fun to watch the change happen before your eyes as you're going. I think it would be fun to use these in combination with the Lazy Daisy to make a sort of floral bouquet. Okay, we rounded the halfway mark for this one. Closing in on it. I love the way the Algerian eye creates sort of an implied circle in the center. Another way to think about drawing this on to a blank piece of fabric is just to draw a circle, a tiny little circle, and then make lines that come up to it that sort of radiate out from the edges of a circle. All right, I've got 3 more lines. Pull that one up. 1, 2, and 3. There we go. That's it for the Algerian eye. I have a few samples to show you and then we'll go on to the next collection of stitches. So over here I have some examples of the feather stitch. I love the way the red looks on this green. It really stands out. Contrasts are awesome. Here's a variation of that feather stitch like we talked about, the stepped side to side feather stitch. There's also some freestyling feather stitch over here. I also have some chain stitch that I'd like to show you. This is the chain stitch on the printed sampler, some Lazy Daisies. Also a bunch of chain stitch over here. This is on a much thicker pearl cotton. I think that size 5 pearl cotton with the chain stitch. I love the way that it gets smaller and then bigger and then smaller again. And then I filled in the background with pink chain stitch and an orange chain stitch. Just like we talked about the running stitch, you can use that to fill in a background and create an all-over texture. It's really the same with any stitch, and the chain stitch is no exception. Here I've made a lot of it kind of side to side and packed it in to make a lot of really interesting texture. Next we're going to move on to some knotted stitches. The French knot is one of those things that tends to drive people crazy. The diagrams in the book seem to always leave out a step. I'm going to show you a really great trick that will improve your French knots instantly, I hope. So, for the French knot, ideally you want to have a milliner's needle, and the milliner's needles are unique in that they have a very small eye and the needle doesn't bulge out where the eye is, so it's a straight shaft all the way down. It allows you to pull the thread back through the knots that you've created easily without it tangling up and bunching. I've got some milliner's needles that are already threaded over here. For the first French knot, I'm going to use this variegated blue again. I'm going to come up from underneath, pull my thread all the way through. You really want to make sure that knot is all the way at the back, just like for every stitch, but it's extra important with the French knot. And now I'm going to lay my hoop down. So my hoop is on the table, which means that both of my hands are free to manipulate the thread. My left hand is going to hold the thread out like this at about a 45-degree angle. I'm holding nice even tension on it. I'm not pulling really hard on it. I'm just holding it evenly like that. And now with my right hand, the needle is going to come from behind to meet that thread. So I'm bringing it from behind. My left hand is going to wrap the needle 3 times. I'm going to continue to hold on to it with my left hand while my right hand is manipulating the needle. I'm going to tilt this needle down and poke it into the fabric right next to where the thread came out the first time. So you can see I'm still holding on with my left hand. I haven't let go with this, and the knot is here about halfway up my needle. The next step, which is the trick, is to pull the thread down to meet the fabric. So you just kind of wiggle it around until you get it how you want it. Sometimes, you might have a weird twist or something, in which case you can just let go, pull it out. You haven't done anything yet. I'm going to start over, bring it from behind, 1, 2, 3, lower it down, pull the thread down to meet the fabric, kind of go back and forth till you have it how you want it. I still haven't let go with this hand. And now, once I've got that little twist there, this is sort of a preview of what the knot's going to look like. Now I can pull the needle all the way through the fabric. And I like to just slide the hoop off the edge of the table so that I can reach around with my hand and pull the needle through to the other side. And now I can let go with my left hand and just pull the thread through. And there's your first perfect French knot. I'm going to make another one right next to it. Come up, slide this back this direction. My fabric's a little loose in the hoop, so I'm just going to tighten it up. Same deal, hold this off to the left at a 45-degree angle. My right hand is going to come from behind with the needle, wrap it 1, 2, 3. You don't want to do more than 3. You could do 2 or 3. More than 3 starts to look not so good, but try it. Pull this down, meet the fabric. Now I can let go, pull this through. Like that. I'm going to do another one. Push this up. 2, 3, lower that down, pull the stitches down to meet the fabric. Whoops, it popped back up, that's okay, just pull it back down. Take that off to the edge, like that. Do one more. 1, 2, 3, poke it in, lower the threads down, arrange them how you want them, and then I'm just going to pull that through. So there's 4 French knots. And you can go on like that. So the French knot is a great way to dot an eye. It can also be the center of a lazy daisy stitch. You can use tons of French knots to build up sort of a mossy texture. It's a really great background stitch. It's a time-consuming background stitch, but it looks amazing. It's got a lot of potential. The next stitch I'm going to show you is the bullion stitch, and the bullion is kind of a natural extension of the French knot. Instead of a tight little bun, it's sort of a long worm-like shape, and it's also a stitch that you want to use a milliner's needle for, or a nice straight needle. You definitely don't want to use a big needle like a tapestry needle. The thinner and straighter, the better. I'm going to come up right next to the French knot for the bullion stitch. So I'm going to grab the thread with my thumb, stick it out of the way. I'm going to go into the fabric. You can see I've kind of gone away from that stitch, and then I'm going to go down with my needle about 1/4 of an inch or a centimeter away from where I originally came out. And then rocking my needle like I did with the running stitch, I'm going to come back up. And at this point, I'm going to push the needle almost all the way through, leaving just the eye of the needle exposed, or about 1/4 of an inch of the needle exposed. So there's a bunch over here and just the eye over here. I'm going to set this down. I like to take off my thimbles at this point. And at this point, I'm going to hold my finger behind the needle, and with my other hand, I'm going to start to wrap this part of the needle with the thread that's coming out at the base of it. So just start to wrap it. and I'm wrapping clockwise. So you wrap it until the amount, you can sort of pack these wraps down. You want to wrap it until the amount wrapped equals the amount of fabric that you've left exposed here. You can also wrap more than that, and instead of having a flat bullion shape, you'll have sort of an inchworm effect, and I'll show you that next. So I've got about the same amount here as I do fabric exposed. So at this point, I'm going to pinch those coils between my fingers, between my pointer finger and my thumb. I'm going to sort of pinch those lightly, and I'm going to pull this needle through. If you have any resistance, you can kind of twist back and forth like this to loosen it up before you pull the needle the rest of the way through. So now I'm going to start to pull it. It's pulling through nice and easily, which is great. I'm going to move my finger just so you can see what it looks like. That thread is pulling through all those wraps. Pulling, pulling, pulling. There it is now. I'm going to keep pulling and lower it back down to that section there. So there's my first bullion stitch. There's still a little bit of thread exposed. I'll point to it with the needle so you can see that little bit of thread there. I'm just going to put my thumb over the top of it and give a pull on this thread, and that disappeared. So then I can just go right underneath, and that secures that little bullion. And this variegated thread is great because it gives you a striped effect. So you have a little stripy bullion. I'm going to come up again and do another one, and on this one we'll do that inchworm effect. So you hold this off to the side, you're going to go down and then come back up. Rock your needle back up right where you started. You've got about 1/4 of an inch exposed, or a little bit less than a centimeter. Gonna prop that up. You can either put your finger behind it like this, or if you like to, you can sort of put your finger behind and rest your thumb on the eye of the needle, and that also props the needle up. Just do whatever position is the most comfortable for you. So same thing, I'm going to wrap this until I've got the same amount wrapped here as I have exposed here. I'm going to wrap a little bit more, and then I'll get this kind of boing or inchworm effect. Same thing, I'm going to grab this, pull the needle through. Here's a little preview. Be careful when you're doing that at home. I'm doing it just to show you. You have to be really careful. It can all come unfurled at this point. So if you can resist peeking, it's a good idea. There you go. So now I'm going to lay this down here. Go back underneath. And you can see that's making a little arch shape there. Now I can easily, it's like a little bridge. I can put my needle underneath that. So that's the bullion stitch. Now we're going to move on to the coral stitch. I'm going to show you that on this printed sampler again. For the coral stitch, you can see here it says coral knot. I'm going to flip this over and work from right to left, traveling along so that my thumb can control the thread just as my hand is controlling the needle. So come up from underneath with the needle, I'm going to grab the thread, and I lay it down sort of like a C shape. On the printed pattern, there are these dots lined up here, and that's where the knot is going to go. The coral knot's kind of like French knots connected by a long line. It's kind of like a train of French knots. So here, where that dot is printed on, or anywhere if you are on a non-printed piece of fabric, my needle is going to go down, and then with the thread over top of it, rock back up. So I'm only taking up a tiny bit of space, just enough to go under the needle, but I'm going through the fabric at the same time. And then this thread is going to go behind like that, behind the needle, and that creates that first little knot. And then I can do it again. So I lay that down in the C shape, I go under, come up again, leaving the thread on top. The needle's going through the fabric, and then I'm going to kind of come up in the center of that loop. Let's do it again. Go down, place the thread there, come up again, go down, place the thread there, come up again, down, come up again, down. Oops, got to get that thread there. And I had that in the wrong position, so I'm just going to put that around like that. There we go, and I've got room for one more. lay the thread down like that. I'm gonna go down, up. See how I'm coming up within that loop? There we go. And then to finish, I'm just gonna go down at the very end. And now I've got a whole row of coral knots, or the coral stitch. I already have spider web set up over here. So the spider web is another weaving stitch. The first weaving stitches we did were the running stitch. Remember, we had those straight lines that we filled back in with a curvy line. The spider web is an opportunity to sort of weave in the round. I've already marked my fabric. There's 9 equal spokes. It's sort of like the pieces of the pie or the spokes in a bicycle. And to get set up, I made 1 stitch from the outside to the inside all the way around. So there's 9 long stitches that make up this one spider web. And now I'm going to show you how to weave back into it to make a really beautiful 3-dimensional stitch. So put my hoop on, and I'm going to grab some thread. For this stitch, this is another great opportunity to use thread that's thick and hard to embroider with otherwise. Like metallics are great, wool is great, really heavy pearl cotton like size 5 pearl cotton, or all 6 strands of embroidery floss, or even you could use 12 strands of embroidery floss. I think for this stitch I'm going to start with a yellow metallic since we haven't used any metallics yet. This is polyester metallic that I found at a rummage sale. So my 9 spokes are already stitched on. I'm going to come up as close to the center as I can. I've got a really heavy tapestry needle, so I managed to poke through there. I'm going to come up from underneath, give a little tug to make sure you're where you need to be. And then it's a lot like making a God's eye if you ever learned how to do that in summer camp. You're going to go over the top and then under, over, under, around and around in a circle continuously. So I'm going over this one, I'm going to go under this one, over, under. After you do 3 or 4, you can pull it through. I'm going under here, so I'm going to go over here, and then I'll go under this one, over, under, over, under. You can see you want to have an odd number of spokes. So on the first round I was going under this one, but since I have an odd number of spokes, I'm back to this one again, and I'm going to be going over it. Over, under, over. I'm going to go over, under, over, under. Once I'm out here, you can see I've already accumulated 1/4 of an inch, almost a 1/2 inch of thread. If I pull really tightly on this at this point, the thread's not going to have anywhere else to go except stack up on itself, so you'll get an even more 2-dimensional effect. So I'm going to pull on that, and it kind of tightens itself in. So I'm going to keep going over, under, over, under. At this point, if you like, you can change colors. To change colors, you just poke under like this, angling towards the center wherever you leave off. So if I wanted to stop here and change colors, or just go underneath like this, I'm going to knot it off on the background here. Just going to tie under there. This thread is sort of hard to work with, as you can see. It would be even harder if I was doing something that was going up and down through the fabric even more. I'm going to trim that, switch to another color. How about red? Find the knotted end. So I'm going to start up here right where I left off. If I can get the thread through, you can see that the last one over here went over, so I'm going to go under, over, under. Over, under, over, under. Over, under, over, under. Over, under, over, under. And you can keep going around like that. I have some great examples that are finished to show you, and as well as some other examples of knotted stitches. Oops, there we go. I'm going to pull this through, and I think I'll stop there. I want to show you some other stitches that are finished up from this last section of knotted stitches. First, we just did a bunch of great knotted stitches. So the first was the French knot. Here you can see how I'm starting to build up that kind of mossy texture. This is the bullion knot. I love how it's different colors here. It kind of looks like the sprinkles on a donut or a cupcake or something like that. You can see here some rows of coral stitch. That's another one like we were talking about before with the chain stitch that you could use to build up a background texture or make sort of a knotted rope for the edge of a fence or something like that. I have some more examples here of the French knot. This one's done with a really heavy thread. Also on this fabric are some more examples of the spider web or the pinwheel stitch, like this one that's yellow and a nice heavy hand-dyed pearl cotton. I think that's size 5. Set those aside. This is the finished version of the sampler that I've been working on. All of the stitches that are printed on this are ones that we just covered today. So you're completely ready to dive in and tackle all of these stitches. You can also customize it. I added my name here. You could add your own name. I added a border with some vintage strips of fabric. You can go in and add more stitches where there aren't any. I'm always an advocate of more is more. So I think the more the better with embroidery. I backed this one with a special vintage fabric. No one's going to see it, but I saw it every time I was tying knots back there, so it's nice to include a nice surprise for yourself as you're sewing along. When you're finished, you can hang it up on the wall. You might sew it into something else. Other people have turned them into pillows or part of a quilt, etc. And you also have a beautiful record of all the stitches that you've learned in this workshop, and you can use those to go on to do any number of amazing embroidery projects.